This is The Road Show, and I'm your host, David Warren. On today's program, it is a thrill to welcome James Merritt, host of the Touching Lives television program and former president of the Southern Baptist Convention. Pastor Merritt joins us by phone from his home near Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome to the program, Pastor Merritt.
Hey, David. Great to be with you. I hope things are going well in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, out there where you are.
Things are going very well, thank you. I listened to this new book you wrote, Character Still Counts, on Audible. I like to listen to books.
Okay.
And so I became quite fond of your Southern accent, so I'm very familiar with your voice. Were you raised in the South?
I was, and let me just say by way of just full disclosure, I hope you enjoyed it. This is the first and only audio book I've ever done, and I will tell you, doing it in a studio and reading it, it's a lot harder than writing it. But yes, I was born in the Deep South. I live in Atlanta, but I was actually born in a town called Gainesville, which is about 50 miles northeast of Atlanta. And except for a few years when I went to seminary and college and pastored, I've been in Georgia most all of my life. So yeah, my Southern accent I come by it honestly.
Well, I not only laughed, but I cried when I heard you read your book. The stories that you tell, it was quite impactful. So you have a new fan, Pastor Merritt.
Well, thank you, David. I give all that to Jesus. Thank you very much.
The subtitle of the book, Character Still Counts, is It is Time to Restore Our Lasting Values. And everybody says amen to that. But tell us why you felt a need to write an entire book on this subject.
Well, frankly, as you know, today's election day, and character's kind of been put back, or in some ways put on the forefront, some ways put on the back burner, depending on who you talk to today. It's amazing. In fact, I was just reading in a book by David Platt, who's a dear friend of mine, that in 2012, 70% of white evangelical Protestants said that character was very crucial and important to who we vote for. And in 2016, it was 2020. It's 30%, which I find to be just mind-boggling in a way. But I just believe that at the end of the day, and this is true for us, I believe individually and as a nation, David, that what really counts at the end of the day and what God values the most is our character. It's not what we do; it's who we are. And I just felt the need, and as did my publisher, that particularly with this election year coming up, that it was just crucial that a book like this come out to remind us that, indeed, character does still count.
You say in the book that when character or morality declines, that we all pay the price. What kind of price do we pay?
Well, I think you see it. I think you see it in the dissolution of the home. I think you see it in declining marriage rates. I think you see it in, you just look, for example, at the music that teenagers listen to today, the language that is used, the civility has gone out the window. Racial tensions are, I think, as high as I've ever seen them. Everybody makes the political personal. It really is. The scripture is right, David. You reap what you sow. You always do. It's a law that you cannot break. And when you sow bad character, you're going to reap bad ethical and moral results. It just happens every time.
Do you feel like this can be turned around? Can we regain our character?
Well, I'm going to give you a surprising answer. No, I don't believe we can turn it around. I believe God can turn it around. And I believe He is the only one that can turn it around. Now, I believe that begins that where we must realize that we need God. And again, today's election day, and I've told our church, I'm so grateful that we live in a country where everybody can go and vote for whomever they want, and I don't make the political personal. I have a church, like I'm sure almost every church. I've got people who will vote for Trump. I've got people who will vote for Biden. I've got people who will vote for either one. And that's okay. But I told our church at the end of the day, if we really believe that any one political personality or individual is going to solve the problems we face as a nation, we really don't understand the problems we face as a nation. because I believe our greatest problem is not political. I don't believe it's economical. I don't believe it's cultural. I believe it is spiritual. And the only one that can solve that problem is God himself.
Do you think that we, when we vote for a candidate, should look at his or her character when making the decision?
Well, for me, and obviously because it would be consistent with what I wrote, I not only think we should, I think it is the first and greatest thing. Now, some people would say, well, it's not the only thing. Well, I will grant that. But if the flip side of it is, I would also contend that of all the things you're going to look at, that must, for me, it has to be at the top of the list.
I found it interesting when you wrote in the book, at the beginning of the 19th century, most obituaries mentioned the character of the person who had died. But by the end of the 20th century, occupation had become the single greatest way in which a deceased person was identified. So we're looking more at the do than the who at this point, obviously, Pastor.
Yeah, isn't that revealing? I mean, again, it goes back to what I said. When someone dies, for example, let's take Steve Jobs. Here's a great example. When we found out that Steve Jobs died, so what was the thought that hit everybody? The iPhone, for example, Apple. That's what we thought about. That's what he did. But the most important thing when he died, the most important thing he discovered, we all do at death, it's not what you did, it's who you were that's really going to count. And when you look at even at the way the Scripture says we're going to be judged by the Lord, and we are going to be judged by the Lord in some way or another, it's always going to be a character-based judgment. And, that's why, for example, here's a great example. Mother Teresa is a classic example. Mother Teresa obviously did accomplish some great things, but she wasn't a CEO 500, Fortune 500 president of a company. She never had any, she had no financial clout. She had no political influence to speak of on her own. She didn't, live in a mansion, and she didn't drive a Mercedes-Benz. But she was one of the greatest people who've ever put sandals on. Why? Because of her character. Because of who she was, not what she did. But the important thing is, it's who she was that gave value to what she did, not vice versa.
Here's a quote that will take us to our first break by today's guest, Pastor James Merritt. He says, "People confuse character with reputation. Your reputation is what people perceive on the outside. Character is what you know is true on the inside." I'm David Warren, and when we come back, we'll discuss which values matter most when building our character. Call a friend. I'm David Warren, here with some exciting news for Oasis listeners. We have a new mobile device app. It's free, easy to download, and lets you enjoy our refreshing music and talk everywhere you go. If you have an Android cell phone, go to the Google Play Store. And if you have an iPhone or iPad, visit the Apple Store and search for Oasis Radio Network. Be an Oasis ambassador and share this news with family and friends around the world.
There's food for the hungry, joy for the sad. I found an oasis of love. Oasis Network.
On today's Roadshow, we are learning more about character and that it still counts. Character Still Counts is the new book out by today's very special guest, James Merritt. It's available wherever books are sold, plus the audiobook is on audible.com. How long did it take you to record this book?
It took me, I was in a studio from morning till afternoon, and I say a studio, in a booth, actually, in a soundproof booth that's about the size of a cracker box. And I think it took me four full days, almost nonstop. And then I had to go back for a full day of redos. So about 5 days.
Well, you did a great job, and I'm glad that I got to hear the book instead of just read the book.
Well, thank you, sir.
Now, I mentioned in the introduction that you served as president of the Southern Baptist Convention. When was that?
That was from 2000 to 2002.
Okay, and how important would you say was your character in the vetting process?
Well, obviously, being Southern Baptists is where our evangelical Christians. I mean, it was tremendously important. And And, that should always be, particularly for us, it has to be. We don't have a choice. It has to be the number one criteria for the selection of that office. And I will tell you, of course, that was when 9/11 took place. So there was a lot of character that was tested back in those days, as you know. So in my particular instance, I had, if you could look at it as a burden or a privilege, I look at it as a privilege, but of going through 9/11, I got to actually spend some time, not to name drop, but the week after 9/11, when President Bush spoke to the nation, I was one of 7 men invited to the Oval Office to meet with the president, which was one of the highlights of my life, who, by the way, he's a strong Christian, strong believer. But I even saw, just as an aside, David, I just saw in President Bush in the Oval Office that Thursday, I'll never forget, I said to myself in talking to him, this is a man of great character, and forget his policies, whether you like what he did or not as president. It really was a man of great character, and it reminded me that day of how important character is, particularly for that office and any office.
Well, when there's a crisis, character is what's needed more than policies.
No question.
Well, there are different building blocks, I'll call them, of character that you list in your book, Character Still Counts. And the first one really is the anchor one. It really could have been the whole book, but it's integrity. Tell us about integrity, if you would.
Yeah, and I appreciate you calling that to the attention of your listeners. When I did this book, and I'll tell you a little interesting story. I've been with Harvest House for a good while, and the publisher is a very good friend of mine, one of my best friends, actually. This is not a book. I did not want to write this book. I'd actually pitched 2 other ideas. They shot down like quail in a field. And they came back with this idea. And the reason I didn't, there's a little secret I'm going to share with your listeners. Most pastors, their books are sermons that some people take and they just turn them into books. So they take the preaching out of it, put the writing into it, and voila, you have a book. This book, I had never preached on any of this, ever. So, I have a PhD, and I did a dissertation, and I can honestly tell you the only thing I've worked harder on in my life than this book was my dissertation, because I literally started from scratch. It took me over a year to write the book. And so, having said that, as we were putting the book together, I don't normally make a lot of demands of our publisher. I try to be a team player, but I said, look, I just want you to know, and they had no problem with it. I said, if we're going to do the book, here's the qualities I believe ought to go in the book, which they agreed with. And I said, and just so you'll know, it doesn't matter where you put the other chapters, but the first chapter has to be integrity. Because I do believe that integrity is the cornerstone of character. And I'll tell you why, David. I have 3 sons, and I told my boys growing up, no matter what else you have in life, if you don't have integrity, you don't have anything. You have missed the boat without integrity. Because integrity, this is the way I define it, is always doing the right thing at the right time, in the right place, regardless of the cost or the consequences. Now, I want your listeners just to think about that for a moment. How different would this nation be if we always, 24/7, did the right thing at the right time, in the right place, regardless of the cost or the consequences? People talk about defunding the police. You wouldn't really need a whole lot of policemen around if everybody did that.
Right.
The vast majority of marriages could work out if both parties would just be people of integrity. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I put that in the book, and I really do believe it is the foundational cornerstone, and I think it's kind of like the fountainhead. The river of character flows from the fountainhead of integrity.
The word integrity derives from the Latin word integer, which means whole or complete, not a fraction or a decimal. Pastor Merritt, you say that you can't have integrity only in certain areas, and I feel the same way about that. And, we need to really be listening, especially before we find a partner or get too deep into that friendship. We need to listen to what these people are saying, and if we're hearing red flags of lack of integrity, we need to know that's not going to be just in that one area.
There's no question. My mentor was a great preacher. Some of your listeners will remember who he was. His name was Dr. Adrian Rogers, and he was my mentor. Dr. Rogers used to say, the greatest thing that can be said about you, he used to call me Jim. He said, Jim, one of the greatest things to be said about you is when somebody says, James Merritt is 12 inches to the foot and 3 feet to the yard. And I thought about that a lot, and I said, you know what? He's right. There is something about someone that just breeds confidence, it breeds respect, it breeds affection, It breeds a connection. When you know a person that from everything you see, you can always count on that person to do the right thing at the right time, in the right circumstance, regardless of the cost or consequences. Honestly, there's something truly magnetic about that person I believe that people are drawn to, I believe that people want to follow.
Who comes to mind when you think of integrity?
You know, the first person, honestly, Dr. Billy Graham. I had the privilege of being with Dr. Graham on several occasions. In fact, I got the privilege of spending an hour with him up in his home in Montreat on his, I think it was right before his 95th birthday. And just being with him, here was a man, David. This man could have been a billionaire if he'd wanted to. He lived in a log cabin. When he came out to meet with me and Teresa and my son Jonathan, he was wearing faded jeans, a flannel shirt, and a $10 Timex watch. And I'm not saying you have to do that to be a man of integrity. That's not my point. But when you think about Billy Graham, whether it is the way he conducted himself with the opposite sex, whether it was the way that he was very careful with the finances of his organization, whether it was the way that he handled the racial situation early in his ministry, you just knew if you cut this man, he bleeds integrity, and he's the first man that comes to my mind.
You also talk about Daniel in the Bible, in your book, as a great representation of integrity.
Yeah, Daniel's right up there in the pantheon. I mean, he's actually, to me, and he's in the Christian Hall of Fame. You know, the thing I love about Daniel, and you could talk about Daniel all day, my favorite story of Daniel is when the king was deceived by the satraps in the kingdom and passed a law that if you prayed to any god other than him, you're going to be thrown into a den of lions and killed. And, you know, there's all kinds of things Daniel could have done, and nobody would have blamed him. Daniel could have said, you know, I've got some overdue vacation. I'm going to leave town. He could have said, well, you know, I've been praying for a long time. God doesn't need to hear from me for, you know, a few days. He didn't do that. He went back, threw open his windows and his doors, and let the whole world know, it may cost me my life, but my integrity demands that I worship only this God, and I've been praying to this God, and I'm not going to stop.
You know, when I heard you read that chapter, I thought, you know, it might come to that for us Christians in these end times at some point.
Well, there's no question, and you know, I want to be careful when I say this because I'm not one of those people that say, well, we Christians, we're really being persecuted in America. No, we're not being persecuted in America. I mean, we may be under some pressure, and we may be under some antagonism. I've been in countries, I've been in communist countries, I've been in Muslim countries where Christians are persecuted. They're persecuted. That said, I think that you have to be blind not to believe. When you look at the culture and you read the tea leaves, it is certainly not going our way. And I see out there, and I don't say this, I'm not whining, I'm not complaining, I'm just stating the fact. I think there's more antagonism and more hostility on the part of at least the extremist out there toward Christianity than I have ever seen in my lifetime. But the flip side of that, and this is what we need to remember, no matter how bad it may get for us now and in the future, it is always going to be, David, a divine opportunity to show our character. Bad times reveal character. That's when your character comes out the most, and I think we need to remember that.
So, in other words, when the heat is on, it's going to be more effective that we maintain godly character than necessarily share our faith with someone.
In fact, I would say they go together. That is one of the ways you share your faith. I think it's one of the greatest ways you share your faith. I mean, I think one of the greatest examples of that in the book of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When they faced the fire, their faith was so strong. They said, you know, not only are we not going to bow down to your false God, we believe that our God can deliver us, but then those three great words, David, but if not. We're going to serve God, love God, worship God, bless God just the same. And it turned the tide that day in the entire kingdom.
Pastor James Merritt is with us today on the program, and we're talking about his book, Character Still Counts, out on Harvest House, wherever books are sold. Also, the audiobook on audible.com. The second building block of character is honesty. And the time in which we live has been called the post-truth era. I think that's a nice way of saying, Pastor, that we live in a time of lies.
Well, we really do, and this is a sad thing. And again, I am not making a political statement. I want to make that very plain. That's the last thing I want to do. However, if I were a politician, there'd be a part of being and I've tried to refer to them as public servants, David, but there'd be a part of being a politician to me that would be very discouraging, because every politician's been tarred with this brush. Well, if you're a politician, you lie, because all politicians lie, and there are jokes about that. And some of it, frankly, let's be honest, by some, and some more than others, very well deserved. But I think today that we are living in an age, you remember the scene, I think it's called A Few Good Men, where Jack Nicholson says, "You can't handle the truth." Mm-hmm. Great scene. That's the culture we live in. People either cannot handle the truth, or if it's not the truth that they like, they literally will discard it for something that's not true. And so, I think more than ever before, in fact, I'd say this, integrity and honesty are really joined at the hip. And let me just say this so people will know. You can be honest without integrity, but you can have integrity without being honest. I'll give you an illustration. Right. If I walk into a bank with a mask on and you're a teller, and I push the note under there, and I say on that note, "Give me your money or I will kill you," I may be being honest. I may be telling you the truth, but I don't have any integrity. Right. So you can be honest without integrity, but you cannot have integrity without being honest. They absolutely go together, and one flows from the other one. According to a Roper Organization survey that you talk about in the book, mm-hmm. people say that clergy tell the truth 49% of the time. Clergy. Doctors tell the truth 48% of the time. Their best friend tells the truth 26% of the time. And I'm scratching my head. Why would people want to have a best friend who lies 74% of the time? That doesn't compute. It doesn't, except the fact of the matter is most people lie. And so when thieves like to be with thieves, and liars like to be with liars, and and I'll tell you something else. As long as they're not lying about you, it doesn't seem to bother us. Mm-hmm. If they lie about somebody else, it's okay. But if they lie about you, it's a different story. More to the point, I don't understand why people want to have friends, business associates. If you're a pastor, people serving on key ministry teams in your church, that you do not want to be truthful with you. I think the single most important thing that a true friend who loves us can give us, David, is truth. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes that's what, speak the truth in love. But the fact of the matter is, truth sometimes hurts. But if you think about it, when you boil it all down, David, I've said this so many times to my boys as well, truth is the only thing that matters when you get right down to it. If it's not true, tell me something that's not true, that if it's not true, that it matters. The only thing that matters is truth. Either Jesus Christ is who he said he was, or he wasn't. It's real simple. It's not complex. He either told the truth about himself or he didn't. All right. If Jesus Christ lied about himself, he really doesn't matter. But if he did tell the truth about himself, he is the only one that matters. So when you get right down to it, truth really is the bottom line of everything. Pastor, if I, myself, have been dishonest, what's the best way for me to clean up my integrity? Great question. I think the first thing you got to do, David, and it's the hardest thing, is to admit it. Just to admit, you know what? I've not been honest here. I've not told the truth here. Then I think the second thing you need to do is, if your dishonesty has indeed affected someone else in a negative way and either has or is or could hurt them, you owe it to that person as well as yourself to go to them and confess that you have been dishonest, and you need to set the record straight. Even if it hurts, even in regards to the consequences, you need to always tell them the truth. Jesus said, I love this about Jesus, he didn't just tell the truth. He said, I am the truth. Jesus was so truthful, he said, I embody truth. That's how important truth ought to be to us. Pastor, you say the bottom line is honesty is important because the lack of it erodes trust, which is the foundation of all meaningful relationships
in every part of our society. We're going to take a break. Before we do, let me let you know that this new book, Character Still Counts, is available wherever books are sold by James Merritt, plus on audible.com if you want to enjoy the audio book. Well, I'm David Warren, your host, and when we come back, we're going to talk about narcissism. Now, everybody knows a narcissist. Back after this.
The Road Show is a listener favorite which airs each weekday here on the Oasis Radio Network starting at 1 p.m. Eastern, 12 noon Central. The Road Show also has a great section on our website, oasisnetwork.org. There you'll find audio archives of select past interviews, plus guest lineup and contact information, and links to our Road Show sponsors and its host. So join us for The Road Show, whether on your radio, computer, or mobile device at oasisnetwork.org.
Well, it's time to restore our lasting values. That's the subtitle of the new book, Character Still Counts, by Pastor James Merritt. And the third building block of character that we'll discuss today is humility. And you have the best definition, Pastor, that I've ever heard. You say humility is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less. Now, that's easier said than done, though. That's the issue here. How to think of ourselves less.
Yeah, and, to your point, this was frankly one of the most difficult chapters to write for this reason. The moment you tell people you're a humble person, you just lost your humility. So it's kind of a difficult thing to grasp onto. I think it's in the book, but I tell the story of a guy that went to church. And he'd been going there for about a year. Well, the pastor called him up to the platform and gave him a medal for being the most humble member of the church. Well, the next Sunday he wore it to church, and they took it away from him. So it's difficult. This thing about humility is difficult to kind of get your arms around. And the other reason why it's so difficult is because nobody is born humble. Nobody. We're all born self-centered. We're all born thinking about ourselves. If you don't believe that, take two grandchildren. If you're a grandparent, you relate to this. Take two kids, one grandchild of one sibling and one grandchild of another one, both, say, 3 years old. Put them in a room with one toy and see what happens. They're not going to share. They're going to fight. They're going to tug. They're going to pull. They're going to fuss. And they're going to cry. And they're going to hit each other because they don't want to share. It's my toy. No, it's my toy. We're born that way. We are all born with this tendency to look out for number one. And that's why I think this is one of the most elusive character traits that I write about. But I think without question, it's one of the most important.
So how do we train ourselves to put the other person first?
I think it begins really, believe this or not, I really do believe that it begins with putting yourself in perspective of where you are with Jesus. I tell my pastor friends all the time, David, I really believe the most humble person on the planet, I really believe what I'm about to tell you, should be a pastor or a preacher. And here's why I believe that. There are two things about me, because you don't know me and I don't even know myself that way. The Bible says the heart's deceitfully wicked, no man knows it. But God knows my heart. And David, I can tell you two things are absolutely true about me. Number one, if I had been God, I would not have saved me. If I had been God, I wouldn't have sent my son for me. Number two, if I'd been God, even if I had saved me, I certainly wouldn't have called me. And there are two things I've never gotten over in my life. I've never gotten over the fact that God saved me. And I've never gotten over the fact that God called me. And so I think the first thing you've got to do is you've got to put yourself in perspective with God. I do tell the story in the book about Theodore Roosevelt. It's a great story. Whenever a visitor would visit the White House, when it got dark, just before they would go to bed, the president would take his guest outside of the White House, and he'd take him out, and he'd just say, look up to the sky. And they would look up, and, of course, they'd see all the constellations of the stars and the galaxies and the solar systems and all that. And Roosevelt would look at it for maybe 2 minutes. And then he would look at his guest, and he'd say, okay, I think we now understand how small we really are. Now we can go to bed. And I think that's the first thing you have to do. You have to humble yourself before the Lord. When you humble yourself before the Lord, David, it's not too hard to humble yourself before other people.
I mentioned before the break that everybody knows a narcissist, and that goes right along this line of, in this case, lack of humility. But there was a narcissism test developed by psychologists who determined that the narcissism score has risen 30% in the last 20 years. And I'm highly suspicious of social media. What do you think, Pastor?
I have no doubt that that's an accurate. In fact, the survey may be, number one, understated. Number two, you've raised a great cultural phenomenon. David, when you look at social media, and by the way, I'm not a cynic. I'm becoming increasingly convinced that social media many times does more harm than it does good. But if you want to look at narcissism in action, go to Instagram, go to Twitter, go to Facebook, go to Snapchat, go to anything you want to. One of the most apt names for something we have or do today is called the selfie. Think about that. Selfie. It's all about self. And I believe, to your point, that we are seeing an increasing narcissistic, self-centered. We think, for some reason, everybody thinks they not only ought to have an opinion on everything, but you ought to know what that opinion is, and not only should you know what that opinion is, you better agree with that opinion. and you see it all the time, and I just think that's where we are as a society today. So I agree with your perspective.
You mentioned earlier, and I was going to bring this up as well, that you're really a doctor. You have a PhD, but the book cover does not say Dr. James Merritt. It just says James Merritt. Tell us why you don't use that title.
Yeah, and I request that, by the way. And again, I'm not against people that use the title. That's not the point. I had a guy say to me one time, David, you appreciate this as a churchgoer. He said, "You know what, James?" He said, "There are so many doctors in the pulpit, you think God is sick." And, I'm just not enamored with titles. I think doctor, unless you're a real, a medical doctor, I get that. But I think doctor is so utterly formal. I don't think it connects with people. I think it separates people. I think it can give people the idea that you're above them. And again, I'm not trying to be falsely humble. I'm not criticizing or judging anyone that doesn't feel that way. That's just a personal, preference for me. And, Jesus himself, they called him. Jesus never asked to be called anything. It's interesting. When you read the Gospels, he never corrected anybody. And, sometimes he'd be called rabbi. Well, he really wasn't a trained rabbi. He was a rabbi, wasn't a trained rabbi. He was a carpenter. But people called him rabbi, not because he went to school or not because he got an honorary degree, but just out of respect. So I do realize there are times that people call me Dr. Merritt out of respect. I appreciate that. I don't get paranoid about it. But I just believe that too often we do, all of us, it's not just pastors, David, we get enamored with titles. And again, it's not the title that makes the person, it's the person that makes the title.
Amen. Well, the fourth building block of character mentioned in Character Still Counts is loyalty. And you wrote that loyalty is now seen as old-fashioned, the height of naivete, and even a character flaw. And so, as a pastor, do you find that, how long have you pastored, first of all?
Well, I have been, this December will be my 44th year as a pastor.
Do you find that there was much more loyalty 40 years ago to a church than there is today?
Oh, absolutely no question. I mean, there's absolutely no question. And I'm not being critical. I'm not whining. I'm not complaining. But there is the consumer mentality of people today when it comes to the church has gone up 7,000% since I became a pastor. And, because obviously there's so many choices out there. I mean, now, because of the pandemic, you can just choose to not even go to any church. You can just stay home and watch a church. And so, I think that brand loyalty particularly has come to an end. And I'd be very quick to say, I don't think anybody ought to go to a church just because out of just sheer blind loyalty. But I do believe that once you find a church where the Word of God is being preached and people are being discipled and the Great Commission is being carried out and hungry people are being fed and naked people are being clothed, Just because maybe you don't like the particular song they did last Sunday, or you don't like the color of the wall they painted, that's no reason to leave a church. And so I do believe there's been a real severe decline of loyalty in the sense you're talking about to the local church.
It's kind of like a plant. You know, you're just starting to get your roots in and grow, and then you just pull it up, and you never become anything but a stunted plant that's not really effective as a Christian.
Well, and I'll tell you, David, to be honest and just, again, extremely candid, which is part of being a good character, a lot of it, to be frank, is accountability. People don't want accountability. They don't like accountability. The average Christian today, I'm just being honest, and I've watched it, the average Christian today, they just want to, when they come, we're now finding that some of our most committed people don't come half the time. When they do come, they just want to come, sit, sing, soak, and leave. They don't want to be bothered with serving. They don't want to be bothered with going on mission trips. They don't want to be bothered with giving. They don't want to be bothered with anything that's going to inconvenience them or get in the way of their cheerleading practices and their golf game or whatever. They just want to kind of do their religious thing and move on down the road.
I would have to say that pastoring must be the toughest job, or one of the toughest jobs out there.
Well, again, look, I love what I do, and because I'm called to do it, and I can't believe I get paid to do what I do. It's just it's the thrill of my life. It's the joy of my life, and I love my people, and even the person I just described, the kind of Christian, they're good people. They're sweet people. They really are. They don't cause trouble, anything like that at all. But when you realize what your job is as a pastor, which is to make disciples, and to make not just make disciples, to make disciples of people who will make disciples, it is extremely frustrating. It is frustrating when you preach over and over about the need to share your faith, and then the needle has never moved that I've seen that only about 4% of believers have ever led one person to Christ. It is frustrating. It is frustrating that 20% of the people give 80% of the money, and 50% of the people don't support the church financially at all. It's very frustrating. But at the same time, I'm sure it can't compare to the frustration of Jesus, and so we just realize at the end of the day that, again, one of the character traits in the book is faithfulness. God's called us to be faithful, not successful, and as a matter of fact, if you're faithful, you are successful.
I'll tell you what, how you walk in love after what you go through as a pastor is a testament to your character, Pastor Merritt.
Well, you know what, and I give all that to Jesus. In fact, I'll say this, and I hope our listeners hear this. When they read this book, and let me just say this so people will know. People may say, well, James, do you live up to all these character traits all the time? Absolutely not. That's why it was such a tough book. Some of these, I can tell you, some of these chapters were extremely convicting to me, and I will tell you, David, that for those who will buy the book, here's what you'll find. There will be some of these chapters, and you're going to read these. You're going to say, hey, I got that one checked off. But you're going to read other chapters, you're going, I think I'm about a quart low here. And I think I need to go back, and I think I need to shore that up. So, it is a difficult book, but I say this to people all the time. If there's anything good about me, it's that Jesus lives in me. If you take Jesus out of me, David, there's not a whole lot there. But the only thing good about me is that Jesus lives in me.
All right, I want to sneak in one more building block of character before we take a break, and this is regarding respect. And you cite 2 recent studies in the book. I'm going to read very briefly here and have you comment, and then we'll take the break. Sure. But you say that only 9% of adults in 2002 said the children they saw in public were respectful toward adults. In 2004, more than 1 of 3 teachers considered leaving their profession or knew another teacher who had quit. The reason? Students' intolerable behavior, according to Public Agenda, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research group. Then in 2005, 70% of people surveyed said people are ruder than they were 20 or 30 years ago. Among the worst offenders were children, according to an Associated Press poll, and the major culprit was parents. Is this something that pastors should be addressing from their pulpits?
Well, absolutely, and I'll be honest, I'll guarantee you, your listeners out there almost unanimously have to be nodding their heads. I'll give you an example. I can tell you 2 words that I never even heard as a kid growing up. Never heard it. Road rage. First of all, you rarely ever saw it. I mean, the worst thing you'd have in road rage is somebody might blow their horn at you or, give you a bad gesture. Today, you cut somebody off, you accidentally turn in front of them, or you drive too slow, you're liable to get shot. And so I think that anybody out there would have to agree that there really is a tremendous lack of respect out there compared to where we were even 20 or 30 years ago.
Okay, the book is called Character Still Counts, out wherever books are sold, plus the audiobook is available on audible.com. The name of the author is, well, I can say it, Dr. James Merritt, also Pastor James Merritt, or he would just say James Merritt. When we come back, we'll talk more about restoring our lasting values. Back after this. Oasis listeners, there are so many good reasons to visit us at oasisnetwork.org. You can access song information, our business sponsors listed by category, details on your favorite radio programs, plus our popular online listening. And while there, click on the Facebook link to like us and stay up to date on what's going on here at the Oasis. Again, our internet website address is oasisnetwork.org. On today's program, it is my pleasure to welcome for the first of, well, 2 times, because he has agreed to do a part 2 on this new book, Character Still Counts, out by James Merritt. And we're so glad that he has said yes to a part 2, because we're not going to have time to cover any more of the building blocks of character, but the others that we will cover, well, as well as we can with the time allotted in part 2, authenticity, generosity, courage, perseverance, self-control, forgiveness, and faithfulness. But I want to spend a little bit of time on the final chapter, and it's about the main character. And you really did a nice job in talking about this main character, who is Jesus Christ, and how he exemplified each one of these building blocks that I just mentioned and we've talked about today. Tell us about this final, very unique chapter of the book.
Well, I told, as I said earlier, I insisted that on the first and the last chapter, I didn't really care about what came in between. But the first chapter is integrity, and I said to Bob, my publisher, Bob Hawkins, I said, Bob, the book really isn't about character. It really is about the main character, who is Jesus. Because I said, when you read the book, we're all going to have the same experience, and I'm trusting you did as well, David, when you listen to it, that, man, I don't always live up to this. I don't always meet this criteria. I don't always display this character. Well, Jesus did. He was a perfect character. And so I show that by simply going, and I don't force it at all. You don't have to with Jesus. I just go and show literally how when you read the Gospels, Jesus displayed every single one of these character traits, and he did it perfectly. And that's what the last chapter is all about.
I found it very interesting that you pointed out that the 4 Gospels of the Bible provide no description of Jesus' physical appearance, yet multiple examples of his character. Wow. You know what's interesting? We're just the opposite today. Today, what do political candidates push? One word, image, sound bites. It's what I look like, what I sound like. We don't even know what his voice sounded like. We never heard his voice. We don't know what he looked like. That's not what mattered. What mattered about Jesus was his character. If you would, read from your book, Character Still Counts, before we take our final break. Yeah, I've got a story in there that I love, David, and I appreciate you letting me have the opportunity to share it. A group of salesmen were leaving a Chicago convention, and they were late arriving at O'Hare International Airport for their flight home. As they hurried into the terminal, they heard the last call for their flight. They ran through that busy airport, dodging this person and that, weaving through the crowd, dragging their luggage behind them. 2 of the men crashed into a table stacked with gift baskets of apples, overturning them, but they all just kept running. They reached their gate just as it was closing and managed to board the plane, except for one man. He stopped and told his buddies to go on, that he would catch a later flight. His conscience was bothering him. And he turned back and found the young boy who was managing that apple stand on his knees in tears, trying to pick up those scattered apples and gift baskets. The salesman got on his knees beside the boy and helped him gather the apples and baskets and set up the display again. Some of the baskets were damaged, many apples were bruised, and a few were missing. The man then opened his wallet.
gave the boy 3 large bills and said, quote, "I believe this will more than cover the cost of the damage, and I'm so sorry we messed up your day. Are you okay, buddy?" Question mark, unquote. The boy, through his tears, managed to get out a, quote, "Thank you," unquote, and the salesman turned to go to the ticket counter to buy another ticket for the flight home. He hadn't gotten far before the boy called out, "Mister?" The man turned around and said, "Yes, son." He said, "Are you Jesus?" Now, I will never be Jesus, and neither will you. But you can think of a greater accomplishment, or can you think of a greater accomplishment in life than to have character of such quality that people would mistake you for Jesus? I would love that case of mistaken identity.
Well, I mentioned at the front of the program that I laughed and I cried. Well, that was one of the crying moments for me.
Yeah, it's powerful. And you know, David, I'm going to be very transparent and honest with you and your audience. I ask myself, would I have gone back or would I have boarded the plane? It's a hard question.
Well, I'm David Warren. We're going to take a quick break and be back with some final words from our special guest, James Merritt.
A refreshing place to be. The Road Show.
I'm David Warren, here with some exciting news for Oasis listeners. We have a new mobile device app. It's free, easy to download, and lets you enjoy our refreshing music and talk everywhere you go. If you have an Android cell phone, go to the Google Play Store. And if you have an iPhone or iPad, visit the Apple Store and search for Oasis Radio Network. Be an Oasis ambassador and share this news with family and friends around the world. Well, on the program today, it has been a pleasure to have Pastor James Merritt, Dr. Pastor, and my favorite Baptist, by the way. I'm so glad that we have another chance in the future to talk more about this book. So stay tuned for part 2 on the book Character Still Counts, subtitled, "It is Time to Restore Our Lasting Values." Well, as we get ready to wrap up, I, David Warren, want to just kind of ask you, have you thought about turning this book into like a Sunday school curriculum, but for all ages?
You know, that's a great question, and we may have done some of that. I'm not sure. I know we've got study guides for it. That would actually be a question I'll submit to my publisher. I haven't done it, obviously, and I don't know that my denomination has done it, but it certainly is an intriguing idea, to say the least. Because
we're going to need some training as a culture in these areas.
Yes, sir.
Well, the book.
Well, I'll tell you, I think I'm going to pursue that. I'm going to be talking to my publishers probably today or tomorrow anyway, and I'll run that by them. Well, imagine if, like, you took each Sunday and covered one of these different building blocks of character that we've discussed and didn't discuss yet. Well, you know what? It's interesting you said that. As a matter of fact, tonight, my chairman of deacons leads a home group, a small group, and they're doing it on Zoom. They're actually going through my book. It just hit me. I forgot. I'm sorry, not tonight, tomorrow night. So tomorrow night, I will be on a 7 o'clock Zoom call with about 25 people from our church who are going through my book right now. Well, there you go. Yeah. Good for all ages. Well, the book, Character Still Counts, is available wherever books are sold, out on Harvest House Publishers. And again, I want to mention that the audiobook read by today's guest with his wonderful Georgian accent is available on audible.com. One more time on the title, Character Still Counts. I also want to say that I know that people have been falling in love with your teaching and the way you express yourself on today's program, so they can watch the Touching Lives television program on your website, touchinglives.org. Give a plug before we say goodbye. Yeah, thank you for that, David. We're on all 144 countries around the world. We're on TBN at every Sunday morning at 8:30 if you get cable. We're on YouTube TV, and of course you can also go to touchinglives.org, and I appreciate the plug. All right, James Merritt has been with us, and stay tuned for part 2. Well, I'm David Warren. I've so enjoyed this hour today, and it's been another great road show. You've been listening to The Road Show. If you'd like to write to us, here's our address. The Road Show, P.O. Box 1924, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 74101.
Our email address is roadshow@oasisnetwork.org. The views of today's guest aren't necessarily those of this station, but we do appreciate and thank our guest for spending this time with us. The Roadshow, an Oasis Network presentation.